All right, so let's start with the big story that we're tracking on WION this hour, where in a blatant attempt to tighten its grip over Hong Kong, China has laid out what it describes as draft reforms that are being discussed at the biggest political meeting of the year. The three terms that form the basic structure of the politics of Hong Kong have not been mentioned in the new report. These terms are one country, two systems, Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, and high degree of autonomy. Remember, Britain ceded the territory of Hong Kong to China in 1997, and at the time, Beijing had made a promise to London that its former colony would enjoy a high degree of autonomy. This meant that Hong Kong would have an executive, a legislative, and also a judicial system of its own. However, Beijing is not willing to keep its promise. Its increasing dominance is now casting a shadow of uncertainty on the democratic values of Hong Kong. For instance, China has imposed the draconian and the controversial security law on Hong Kong. It also introduced a life imprisonment for cases related to what China understands as secession, subversion and terrorism. It also has made way for cases to be tried in mainland China for offences that China deems were committed in the territory of Hong Kong. Moreover, in a bid to overhaul Hong Kong's electoral system, China is now taking steps to make sure that so-called patriots in Hong Kong are in charge. Now, according to China's new proposal, any candidate for Hong Kong's partially elected legislature must be nominated by a pro-Beijing committee. The Vice Chairman of the National People's Congress Standing Committee, Wang Chen, has said that Beijing-controlled election committee will be tasked with electing a large proportion of the Legislative Council members and also directly participating in the nomination of all Legislative Council members. Now, other changes have also been put forth, and these include increasing the size of the election committee from 1,200 members to 1,500 members, increasing the city's legislature from 70 to about 90 seats. Election for Hong Kong's legislature will likely be deferred to September 2022. Many fear that Beijing wants to further crack down on the democratic opposition. Now, most of these so-called reforms are expected to deprive Hong Kong's democratic camp of any hope of winning a majority in the Legislative Council. Remember, these sweeping changes come at a time when 47 prominent pro-democracy activists have been charged with subversion in Hong Kong. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what all of these proposed so-called reforms actually mean, we are joined in by our correspondent Richard Kimber, who is joining us live from Hong Kong. Richard, thank you very much indeed for joining us in this broadcast. Now, it's very interesting what is being discussed right now at this point of time by the authorities in Beijing. The proposed draft reforms as are being spoken about, does this now effectively mean that elections in Hong Kong may no longer be democratic? Elections in Hong Kong may no longer be as per the spirit of a one state, two systems principle?
Well, the concern very much here from any pro-democracy party or pro-democracy campaigner is that these types of reforms will effectively, as you say, end any involvement really of any significance from any of those opposition pro-democracy parties. One example of this is there's a concern here that the way that the chief executive, the top job in Hong Kong, is elected will change such that the district council seats that make up around a tenth of the committee that chooses the chief executive may be wiped out altogether and replaced instead by a block of pro-Beijing officials. Now, the reason that's so significant right now, and the reason that it's of such concern to pro-democracy campaigners, is in the most recent district council elections, the pro-democracy camp won almost every single district in Hong Kong. They won 17 out of 18 of those districts, largely because those elections came right at the height of anti-government protests in 2019. And so it really gave those pro-democracy parties huge momentum leading into what would have been the legislative election last year had it not been postponed for the COVID-19 pandemic. So having built up all of that public support, it looks like these pro-democracy parties may then end up losing the ability to capitalise on that if those pro-democracy district council seats are basically wiped out altogether from the election process for the chief executive. So it's these types of reforms and these types of concerns that are making this a very big story here in Hong Kong, as people are worried about the way that the city's electoral future will develop.
Right, now that's an important point that you made. So how are the pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong looking at these proposed draft reforms?
Well, there's just a great deal of concern because there's an acceptance here to a certain extent now about the future of Hong Kong's integration with China, an understanding that this is an inevitable process and that it's inexorable. There's really no evidence at all that any level of frustration or campaigning here on the part of local campaigners nor any international sanctions are making any difference to Beijing's intent over the way that it plans to further integrate Hong Kong into the Chinese political system. But the crucial thing is the timing and the manner with which this is happening. Many campaigners here say this is all happening far too quickly and it's happening in a way that is far more aggressive, in their words, than they would think is appropriate based on the understanding that they thought existed between China and the UK during that handover agreement. And so these types of reforms, some of them very technical and hard to understand for an overseas audience, others, like the ones I just mentioned, really quite clear-cut, because if, as I say, some of those district council seats or all of those district council seats are simply wiped out and replaced by pro-Beijing officials, it's a pretty clear sign of what Beijing's trying to do with this electoral process, and that's what's concerning so many democracy campaigners here.
Now, at this point of time, there are 47 prominent pro-democracy activists who are in fact charged with subversion under the controversial national security law. The question that I want to ask you is, at this point of time, do we know whether many of these pro-democracy activists are actually seeking asylum abroad, and how many of them would actually like to leave Hong Kong?
Well, at the moment, none of them can do anything because they're all still being detained. This marathon trial lasted four days in the end. It was due to be a one-day trial, but ended up running across all of this week. It just finished late on Thursday night. Now, 15 of those 47 have been granted bail, according to the court, but they're still in detention because immediately after that granting of bail was issued, the prosecution issued an immediate appeal, and so everybody is still in detention despite that bail having been granted. Those 15 who have been granted bail are due to go back into court within the next 48 hours as part of that appeals process, and they do stand a chance there of having that bail firmly granted and then being released, albeit until the main trial starts at the end of May. If that does happen, even those 15 who are released on bail will still have travel bans instituted on them, and they will also be banned from talking in any form, be it email, be it telephone, or any kind of communication with any foreign overseas official. That's a bid to try and prevent any kind of lobbying taking place by these activists for more international support. There's a range of restrictions like that being placed on them if they are indeed given that bail they've been granted. What might happen after that is only really a guessing game, because it all depends on whether or not after that trial proceeds, and as I say, that's not even due to start until the end of May, any of these activists are in a position to actually leave the city. For the time being, as I say, everybody is still in detention, and because there are so many of them, it really is having a huge impact on the pro-democracy movement here, because with 47 high-profile people in court over this charge of subversion, it's made a huge dent in the resources that the pro-democracy camp still has, when so many before them have already been arrested.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Richard Kimber, for joining us and getting us all those updates from Hong Kong there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.